The air inside the grand ballroom felt heavy, almost thick enough to touch. It wasn't just the air conditioning struggling against the heat of 200 bodies. It was the weight of expectation. This was the final stage of the National Mathematics Championship, a place where silence was usually louder than applause. Outside, the city of New York was buzzing with taxis and tourists, but in here, time seemed to move slower. The only sounds were the rhythmic ticking of a large digital clock on the wall and the occasional nervous shuffle of a shoe against the carpeted floor. At the center of it all stood a long row of tables, each occupied by a student who had spent their entire life preparing for this single moment. They were the best of the best. The mathletes who could calculate the tip on a dinner bill in nanoseconds and visualize calculus in their sleep. Most of them looked like they belonged in a catalog for private academies. They wore crisp blazers, polished shoes, and haircuts that probably cost more than a week's worth of groceries. They sat with perfect posture, their expensive pens resting lightly on fresh, white pads of paper. But then there was a Han. She sat at the very end of the row, table 12. If you looked at the lineup from a distance, she seemed to fade into the background. She didn't have a matching blazer. Instead, she wore a simple light blue cardigan that her mother had bought on sale 3 years ago. It was a little bit too big for her, with the sleeves rolled up twice so her hands could move freely. Underneath, she wore a white shirt that had been ironed so many times the fabric was starting to shine a little. Anya adjusted her glasses, pushing them up the bridge of her nose with her index finger. Her hands were resting on the table, but they weren't still. Her left thumb was tapping a nervous, silent beat against her knee. Thump, thump. It was a habit she couldn't break. A physical outlet for the storm that was always raging inside her mind. She looked around the room. The audience was seated in the dark, rows of faces illuminated only by the glow of the stage lights. She could see parents clutching programs, fathers with their arms crossed tightly over their chests, mothers whispering into cell phones. She knew they weren't looking at her. They were looking at the boy 3 tables down. That was Julian. Julian was the reigning champion. He had won the regional title 3 times in a row. He sat with an air of calm confidence, like a king waiting for his subjects to bring him food. He had a fancy mechanical pencil, the kind you click to extend the lead, and he was currently clicking it rhythmically. Click, click, click. It sounded like a countdown. Anya knew who Julian was. Everyone knew. He came from a school that had a dedicated math institute with laptops and professors who acted like personal trainers for the brain. Anya's school didn't have an institute. Her school was an old brick building on the other side of the city, where the windows stuck shut in the summer and the radiator hissed loudly in the winter. Her math club met in a dusty classroom after school, sitting on scratched desks, sharing a single box of donuts if they were lucky. She wasn't supposed to be here. That was the story the judges had whispered when she walked in for the preliminaries. She had heard them, or at least she felt their eyes. Where did she come from? One had asked. Is she an alternate? But Anya wasn't an alternate. She was the wild card. The girl who had solved the state qualification test in half the allotted time using a method that wasn't in any textbook.
Oh, welcome.
Everyone, the voice of the moderator boomed over the speakers. Shaking Anya out of her daydream, the moderator, a man with a kind face and a gray mustache, stepped up to the microphone. We have reached the final round of the evening. This is the lightning round. The rules are simple. Speed is key. Accuracy is everything. Anya took a deep breath. She filled her lungs with the cool, conditioned air. She closed her eyes for a split second and pictured the numbers in her head. To her, numbers weren't just symbols on a page. They were colors. They were shapes. A 5 wasn't just a line and a curve. It was a specific shade of purple. A 7 was a jagged, bright yellow spike. When she did math, she wasn't calculating. She was painting a picture. For this final challenge, the moderator continued, we will be projecting the problems onto the main screen. You will have 2 minutes to solve the final equation. 2 minutes may sound like a long time, but for what you are about to see, it is a blink of an eye. The audience rustled. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Julian stopped clicking his pencil. He leaned forward, His eyes locked on the blank white screen hanging above the stage. Anya felt a small bead of sweat roll down her back. She wasn't scared of the math. She was never scared of the math. The math was the safe place. The math was the only place where the rules never changed, where the answer was always waiting for you if you looked hard enough. What scared her was the feeling of being an imposter. She looked down at her sneakers. They were simple white canvas shoes, slightly scuffed at the toe. She remembered how her older brother had tied the laces for her that morning, telling her to go show them how smart you are. She wanted to make him proud. She wanted to make the teachers at her old school proud. The ones who stayed late to help her when they didn't have the resources to teach her what she already knew. "Ladies and gentlemen, please silence your phones," the moderator said. The room went dead silent. The hum of the air conditioner suddenly seemed very loud. Anya placed her hands on the desk, palm down. She felt the texture of the table, rough and cool. She grounded herself. She wasn't the girl in the too big cardigan anymore. She wasn't the wild card from the public school. She was just a mind, ready to work. She looked over at Julian one last time. He was stretching his fingers, as if preparing to play a piano concerto. He looked calm. He looked like he owned the stage. He didn't look back at her. Why would he? In his eyes, the competition was probably between him and the clock. Anya was just part of the scenery. But if Julian had looked, he would have seen something interesting. He would have seen that Anya wasn't shaking anymore. Her thumb had stopped tapping. Her breathing was slow and steady. Her eyes, behind those thick frames, were not wide with fear. They were narrowed, focused, and incredibly sharp. She was a runner in the blocks, waiting for the gun. The moderator walked to the side of the stage and nodded to the technician in the back. The giant screen flickered to life, casting a blue glow over the contestants' faces. "Contestants ready?" the moderator asked. Anya didn't nod. She didn't move a muscle. She just stared at the center of the screen, waiting for the problem to appear. In her mind, she was clearing a space, sweeping away the dust, making room for the numbers to dance. "Let the round begin," the moderator said. The clock on the wall didn't make a sound as it started its countdown, but everyone in the room could hear it in their heads. Tick, tick, tick. Anya's heart didn't beat faster. In fact, it felt like it slowed down. The noise of the crowd, the pressure of the expectations, the smell of the expensive perfume on the lady in the front row, it all faded away. There was only the screen. And there was Anya, and she was ready. The giant screen hung over the stage like a looming cloud waiting to burst. The silence that had filled the ballroom just moments ago felt different now. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy. It felt like the moment right before a thunderstorm breaks, where the air is so thick you feel like you might choke on it. The audience wasn't just watching. They were holding their breath collectively. 200 people all inhaling at the same time and forgetting to exhale. On the stage, the tension was even sharper. You could practically see the nerves vibrating through the air. The moderator, a man who had hosted this event for a decade and usually cracked jokes to ease the mood, stood stiffly behind his podium. His face was serious, his eyes wide as he looked down at the small card he was holding. He looked like he was holding a dangerous explosive rather than a piece of paper. "Ladies and gentlemen," the moderator's voice boomed, echoing slightly off the high walls. "For the final round of the lightning round, we have decided to raise the difficulty level. In the history of this championship, we have never seen a problem like this. It was designed by professors at the Institute of Advanced Mathematics as a theoretical challenge." A murmur rippled through the crowd. It wasn't a cheer. It was a sound of confusion and worry. People leaned forward in their seats. Parents of the contestants squinted at the screen, trying to understand what was happening even before the problem appeared. The moderator continued. "This equation combines elements of calculus, three-dimensional geometry, and abstract algebra. It is a multi-layered problem that requires not just calculation, but vision. The time limit is 2 minutes. Good luck." He stepped back, and with a dramatic flair, he pressed a button on his console. The screen flickered, flashed white for a second, and then settled into a deep, bright blue. Then, the numbers appeared. If you didn't know math, It just looked like a terrifying jumble of symbols. It was a dense, complicated block of white text against the blue background. There were square roots nesting inside fractions, Greek letters scattered like confetti, and integration symbols that stretched on forever. It looked less like a math problem and more like a foreign language written by a madman. It was the kind of problem that gives high school students nightmares. The reaction on the stage was instant and brutal. The boy 3 tables down, Julian, didn't hesitate. He was a machine built for this. He grabbed his fancy mechanical pencil and attacked the paper. Scritch, scritch, scratch. The sound was frantic, like a squirrel trying to dig a hole in concrete. His head snapped down, his eyes locked on his desk, and his hand moved so fast it blurred. He was breaking the problem down, tearing it into smaller pieces, trying to digest it bite by bite. He looked confident, but if you looked closely at his jaw, you could see it was clenched tight. He was grinding his teeth. The other contestants reacted in panic. A girl near the middle dropped her pencil, her hands shaking too much to hold it. A boy at the end just stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open, looking like a deer caught in headlights. You could see the defeat in their eyes immediately. They saw the wall, and they knew they were going to crash into it. But at table 12, Anya didn't move. She didn't reach for a pencil. She didn't look down at her paper. She didn't panic. In fact, she went incredibly still. It was the kind of stillness you see in a hunting dog that has spotted a bird in the bushes. Every muscle in her body relaxed, except for her eyes. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, locked onto the glowing screen. While the rest of the room saw a monster, Naya saw a map. To the judges and the audience, Anya looked like she had frozen. They thought the pressure had finally gotten to her. They thought the girl from the underfunded school had realized she was out of her league. A few people in the audience shook their heads sadly. They felt sorry for her. But inside Anya's head, there was a loud, beautiful symphony playing. She didn't see x squared or logarithms. She saw shapes. The numbers on the screen weren't static. They were moving for her. The complicated fraction at the beginning of the equation wasn't math. It was a heavy, dark purple anchor. The integration sign wasn't a symbol. It was a bright yellow curve that wrapped around the anchor. She wasn't calculating. She was watching the pieces of a puzzle float in the air, waiting for them to click together. She ignored the noise around her. The scritch-scratch of Julian's pencil sounded like a distant, annoying insect. She didn't care how fast he was writing. Speed didn't matter if you were going the wrong way. The giant digital clock on the wall changed. 1:40, 1:35. The seconds were ticking away. Disappearing like water down a drain, the moderator watched the contestants with a furrowed brow. He looked at Julian, who was already filling up half his page with workings. He looked efficient. He looked like a winner. Then the moderator's eyes drifted to the end of the row. He frowned. He saw Anya sitting there, hands in her lap, staring at the screen. Is she stuck? He whispered to the judge sitting next to him. The judge shrugged, looking concerned. Maybe she can't see the screen from that angle. They both watched her, expecting her to grab her pencil any second. Surely she had to start writing. You can't solve a problem that complex in your head. It's impossible. The human brain isn't wired to hold that many variables at once without writing them down. That is what every math teacher in the world would tell you. Write it down. Show your work. But Anya had never liked showing her work. It felt like a waste of time. Why draw a map of the road when you can just drive the car? She squinted slightly at the screen. The problem was a maze. The trick was realizing that most of the maze was fake. It was full of decoys. There were terms in that equation that looked scary but canceled each other out perfectly if you just noticed their relationship. It was like a magic trick. The magician waves one hand to distract you while the other hand does the work. The scary symbols were the waving hand. Anya ignored the waving hand. She looked for the secret. She visualized the equation in 3 dimensions. In her mind, she rotated the ugly blob of numbers. She turned it upside down. She looked at it from the side. And there, hiding in the back, was the simple, clean heart of the problem. It was a small, elegant number that was hiding behind all the noise. It had been there the whole time, waiting for someone to be quiet enough to hear it. On the stage. The scratching noise from Julian's table was getting faster and more desperate. He was sweating now. A dark stain was spreading on the back of his crisp blue shirt. He had calculated the first layer, but the second layer was giving him trouble. He kept having to erase things, erasing so hard his paper was starting to tear. He could feel the time slipping through his fingers. It was like trying to hold on to sand. The harder he tried, the faster it fell. The audience was getting restless. The silence was turning into anxiety. People were shifting in their seats, checking their own watches, glancing from the screen to the contestants and back again. They couldn't believe anyone could solve this in 2 minutes. It looked like a torture test. "Come on," a father in the front row whispered, squeezing his wife's hand. His knuckles were white. The clock kept ticking. It showed 1 o'clock left. 1 minute. Half the time was gone. Julian was frantically scribbling a new set of formulas, trying a different approach. He looked frustrated. He was fighting the problem, wrestling it to the ground. It was a brawl. But Anya wasn't fighting. She was dancing. She saw the last piece of the puzzle slide into place in her mind. The colors aligned. The shapes stopped spinning and settled into a perfect, still picture. The noise in her head stopped. The symphony ended on a single, clear note. She had the answer. It wasn't a guess. It was a certainty. It was as solid as the ground she walked on. Anya slowly pulled her right hand out of her lap. She didn't reach for a pencil. She didn't need to write anything down. She reached for the small black buzzer button that sat in the center of her table. The crowd didn't notice. Their eyes were on Julian, the champion. They were watching his hand fly across the paper, assuming the battle was between him and the clock. They didn't see the quiet girl at the end of the table move her finger. She hovered her hand over the button. She took one last breath. She didn't do it to be fast. She didn't do it to beat Julian. She did it because the picture in her head was complete. There was no reason to wait. Her finger came down. Asterisk, the sound that cut through the room wasn't loud, but it was sharp. It was a harsh, electronic buzz that seemed to slice right through the heavy silence like a knife through butter. It echoed off the high ceiling of the grand ballroom, bouncing off the walls and startling everyone in the audience. Instantly, the scratching sound from Julian's pencil stopped dead. Heads snapped toward the source of the noise. 200 people turned in their seats in perfect unison, a wave of motion rippling from the front to the back of the hall. They all expected to see Julian's hand raised. They expected the champion to have finished his flurry of calculations. But when their eyes landed on the buzzer, the room seemed to tilt on its axis. The hand hovering over the button wasn't wearing a school blazer with a fancy crest. It was a hand belonging to a girl in a loose blue cardigan. It was Anya. For a split second, nobody moved. It was as if time had stopped. The audience stared with their mouths slightly open. The judges looked at each other, their eyebrows raised so high they nearly disappeared into their hairlines. Even the moderator looked confused, glancing down at his script and then back at the girl at the end of the row. Wondering if there was some kind of technical malfunction, Julian froze in the middle of a calculation. His mechanical pencil was hovering over his paper, the tip just about to touch the paper. He looked over at Anya, his face a mixture of shock and annoyance. It was the look of someone who has been running a race alone for miles and suddenly hears footsteps right next to them. He couldn't believe it. He had pages full of work. He had been sweating and struggling for over a minute. How could she be done? He hadn't even seen her pick up a pencil. The giant digital clock on the wall seemed to mock them. The red numbers glowed brightly in the dim light. 1 minute and 2 seconds. The silence that followed the buzzer was even heavier than the one before. It was a confused silence. People in the crowd started whispering, leaning in to talk to their neighbors. Is that the buzzer? I think she hit it by accident. She looks confused. Maybe she made a mistake. Anya heard none of this. To her, the room was completely empty except for the moderator. She pulled her hand back from the button and sat up straighter. She took a deep breath, feeling her heart rate finally start to slow down. The frantic energy that had been buzzing under her skin was gone, replaced by a calm sense of certainty. She felt the way you feel after you finally found your keys after looking for them. For an hour, a wave of relief and clarity. The moderator cleared his throat, stepping back up to the microphone. He looked at the judges, who gave him a hesitant nod. He seemed unsure. Usually, when someone buzzed this early on a problem this hard, it was a disaster. It was usually a student who had panicked and just taken a wild guess. Table 12. Anya, the moderator said, his voice cautious. You have buzzed in. Do you have an answer? Anya didn't stand up. She didn't need to. She just looked him directly in the eyes. Yes, I do, she said. Her voice was steady, not shaking at all. It was a simple, plain sound that cut through the murmuring of the crowd. On the stage, Julian let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a sound of disbelief. He shook his head and went back to his paper, scratching his head with the eraser end of his pencil. He was muttering under his breath, frustrated. He clearly thought she was throwing away her chance. He thought she was guessing. And why wouldn't he? The problem was a monster. It had taken him a full minute just to set up the first part of the equation. There was no way she had solved the whole thing in her head in 60 seconds. The audience held its collective breath again. But the mood had changed. Before, they were waiting for a battle. Now, they were waiting for a car crash. They were expecting her to say a number that was way off, something ridiculous. They were preparing to feel sorry for her. Please state your answer for the record, the moderator said. He looked down at his paper, ready to write it down, probably ready to shake his head and tell her it was incorrect. But Anya didn't look nervous. She didn't fidget with her glasses. She didn't look down at her hands. She just spoke. 8,422, she said. She said it slowly, pronouncing every syllable clearly. 0.35. The number hung in the air like smoke. The moderator froze. His pen hovered over his paper, but he didn't write. He just stood there, blinking. Julian stopped moving. His hand froze in midair above his desk. He slowly turned his head to look at her, his eyes narrowing. He ran the number through his head, checking it against the partial calculations he had done. His eyes went wide. The color seemed to drain out of his face. In the audience, the mathematicians and the teachers started doing the same thing. The ones who had been following along on their own scrap paper looked up from their desks in shock. A few of them dropped their pencils. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air before a tornado touches down. Everyone was looking at the giant screen, then at the judges, then back at Anya. The problem was a riddle wrapped in an enigma. The answer, if calculated correctly, was supposed to be a complex, ugly decimal that went on forever. But the trap of the problem was that all those complex decimals canceled out, leaving a shockingly simple, clean integer with a small remainder. It was like opening a safe, expecting to find millions of dollars, and finding a single, perfect diamond instead. Anya's answer was clean. To clean, it was beautiful. The head judge, a man with silver hair and thick glasses, tapped furiously on his keyboard. His fingers were flying across the keys, his face illuminated by the glow of his monitor. He was checking the work, verifying the solution against the official answer key that had been locked in a safe just an hour ago. It felt like an eternity passed, even though it was only 10 seconds. The clock on the wall kept ticking. 1 minute and 15 seconds. 20 seconds. The time was still running, even though the round was effectively over. Usually, if someone buzzed in and got it wrong, the other contestants would continue until the time ran out. But nobody moved. Nobody was writing anymore. They were all just watching the judge. The moderator looked at the judge, waiting for a signal. The judge didn't look up. He kept typing, squinting at the screen. He checked the calculation once, then twice, then a third time. Anya sat perfectly still. She watched the judge, not with fear, but with patience. She knew what the answer was. She had seen the shape of it in her mind. She didn't need a computer to tell her what she already knew, but she waited for them to catch up. It felt like she was standing at the finish line of a race, waiting for everyone else to realize the race was over. Julian looked back and forth between his paper and the judge. He had stopped trying to solve it now. He knew, deep down, that he had been beaten. He looked at Anya again, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the calmness on her face. He saw the way she sat, relaxed and composed. He realized with a sinking feeling in his stomach that she hadn't been guessing. She hadn't been panicking. She had been seeing something he couldn't see. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, but they were different now. They weren't whispers of confusion. They were whispers of realization. Did she say 8,422? That's the simplification. How did she see that? There is no way she did that in her head. The tension in the room was vibrating like a guitar string that had been tightened too much. The judge stopped typing. He stared at his screen for a long moment. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, then put them back on. He looked up from his computer and locked eyes with the moderator. The moderator leaned in, desperate for the verdict. The judge didn't speak into the microphone. He just gave a single, slow nod. He nodded his head up and down, one sharp motion. The moderator's eyes widened. He looked back at the table where Anya sat. He looked at the clock, which now read 1 minute and 28 seconds. "Ladies and gentlemen," the moderator said, his voice trembling slightly, "please, wait." But the audience didn't wait. They had seen the nod. The realization swept through the room like a wave of electricity. The girl in the blue cardigan, the girl from the public school, the girl who didn't write anything down, had just solved the impossible problem. The moderator stood frozen for a moment, his hand hovering over the switch that would control the massive sound system. The nod from the head judge had been small, almost invisible to anyone not looking for it. But it felt like a starting gun had gone off inside the man's chest. He looked from the judge's table to the girl sitting calmly at table 12. He cleared his throat. A sharp, loud sound that made the microphone crackle. The noise brought the restless murmuring of the crowd to a complete halt. 200 pairs of eyes locked onto him. In that second, the moderator realized he wasn't just an announcer anymore. He was the bridge between a miracle and the people witnessing it. He leaned in close to the microphone, his voice dropping an octave, becoming serious and deep. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, the words coming out slowly, "I have received verification from the head judge." The room felt like it was holding its breath all over again. The air conditioning seemed to stop blowing. The ticking of the clock on the wall, which had reached the 1 minute and 30-second mark, was the only sound. It was a countdown that no longer mattered, but it kept going anyway, indifferent to the history being made below it. The moderator glanced down at his paper one last time, even though he didn't need to. He looked back up at Anya. She hadn't moved. She was still sitting with her hands resting in her lap, looking up at him with those wide, steady eyes behind her glasses. The answer given by the contestant at table 12, the moderator continued, pausing for effect, is correct. For a heartbeat, there was absolutely no sound. It was a vacuum of silence. People's brains were trying to process the word they had just heard. Correct. On a problem that was designed to be unsolvable in 2 minutes, solved in under a minute. Without writing a single thing down, then the dam broke. It didn't start as a cheer. It started as a gasp, a collective intake of air from 200 lungs that sounded like a rushing wind. Then, a few people near the front stood up. Then a few more. Then, like a wave rising from the ocean, the entire crowd was on its feet. The applause wasn't just polite clapping. It was a thunderclap. It was a roar of pure shock and admiration. Hands slapped together so hard it stung. People were shouting, whistling, looking at their neighbors with their mouths open, shaking their heads in disbelief. On the stage, Julian's head dropped. He didn't look up at the crowd. He didn't look at the screen showing the answer. He just looked down at his paper, which was covered in frantic, messy calculations. He had filled half a page with numbers and formulas, sweating and stressing for 90 seconds, only to be beaten by a girl who hadn't even broken a sweat. He slowly put his mechanical pencil down on the table. It rolled away, coming to a rest against his calculator. He sat there for a moment, shoulders slumped, the weight of the loss settling on him. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but deep down even he knew that what he had just witnessed was something extraordinary. The moderator was waving his hands, trying to regain control, but the crowd was too loud. He smiled a genuine, wide smile that showed his teeth. He let them go on for a moment, letting the energy of the room wash over the stage. He looked at Anya and saw that she was finally reacting to the noise. She didn't jump up and down. She didn't cheer for herself. Instead, a small, shy smile spread across her face. It reached her eyes, crinkling the corners. She looked down at the table, almost like she was trying to hide, bringing a hand up to cover her mouth. It was the reaction of someone who was used to being in the background, suddenly finding herself in the spotlight. It was humble and honest. As the applause began to die down slightly, the moderator turned back to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please." A moment of silence for the competitors. He shouted, laughing a little. The noise settled, but people remained standing. The energy in the room had shifted completely. It was no longer a stiff, boring academic competition. It felt like a rock concert. The moderator turned his attention to the judges' table. Because of the speed and accuracy of this solution, the judges have determined that the round is concluded early. There is no need for the remaining time. He looked down at Anya again. "Anya, that was historic. I am told that the verification team checked your answer 3 times because they couldn't believe the timing." Anya nodded slightly, her face flushing a little red. "Can you tell us?" the moderator asked, his voice gentle now, inviting her in. "How did you solve it so quickly? We saw you didn't write anything down." This was the question everyone wanted to know. The audience leaned forward, craning their necks to hear her small voice. Anya reached up and adjusted her microphone, pulling it a little closer. She took a breath. "I didn't see the numbers as math," she said, her voice echoing clearly through the hall. "I saw them as shapes. The problem looked like a messy knot, but I knew that if I looked at it from the right angle, the knot would undo itself. I didn't need to calculate the threads. I just needed to see the knot." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. The variables at the start and the variables at the end were mirrors of each other. They canceled out to make a circle. The answer was just the diameter of that circle. It was simple. The crowd was silent again, but this time it was a silence of awe. It made sense to her. It was beautiful and simple, but to the mathematicians in the room, it was a level of abstract thinking that was usually reserved for geniuses like Einstein or Ramanujan. She had seen a pattern in the chaos that no one else had seen. Julian looked up. The frustration on his face had faded, replaced by curiosity. He looked at his paper, then at the screen. He tried to visualize the knot she was talking about. For a second, his eyes lit up. He saw it. He saw the circle. He realized that while he had been trying to chisel away at the rock with a hammer and chisel, she had just walked around the rock and looked at the other side. Anya looked over at Julian. She saw him staring at the screen with a look of realization. She didn't feel like gloating. She didn't feel like a winner beating a loser. She just felt like she had shared a secret. The moderator chuckled into the mic. "Well, I think that explains why I failed calculus in high school. I was looking at the threads, not the knot." Polite laughter rippled through the room. "And now," the moderator said, his voice booming again, full of excitement, "we have a new national champion. Please give a round of applause for Anya." The applause exploded again, even louder than before. It was a wall of sound. Confetti cannons shot off from the sides of the stage, blasting colorful paper streams into the air. The gold and silver ribbons rained down on the contestants, sticking to their hair and clothes. Anya stood up. Someone from the event staff handed her a large, heavy trophy. It was made of crystal and weighed a ton. She held it with both hands, looking at the way the light refracted through the glass. She looked out at the crowd, looking for the people who mattered most to her. She saw her brother in the back row. He was standing on his chair, waving his arms wildly, a huge grin on his face. He was shouting something she couldn't hear, but she knew what it was. She saw her teacher, an older woman with gray hair, wiping tears from her eyes with a handkerchief. For the first time all day, Anya felt a tear slide down her own cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, and it wasn't a tear of fear. It was a tear of release. The pressure that had been building up inside her chest for months, the worry about money, the worry about fitting in, the worry that she wasn't good enough, all of that washed away with the applause. She had done it. She hadn't just won a trophy. She had proven that you don't need expensive suits or private tutors or fancy computers to touch the sky. You just need a quiet mind and a different way of seeing the world. She held the trophy up high. The crowd roared. The flashbulbs from cameras went off like a constellation of stars, blinding and bright. In that moment, the girl in the blue cardigan wasn't just Anya from the public school anymore. She was the girl who beat the clock. She was the girl who solved the impossible, and she had done it in 58 seconds. The confetti was still drifting through the air, settling on the polished floor of the grand ballroom like multicolored snow. The applause had died down to a low, buzzing murmur, but the energy in the room felt like it had been permanently altered. It was as if someone had opened a window in a stuffy room, letting in a fresh, cool breeze. People were standing in clusters, talking animatedly, their hands waving as they tried to describe what they had just seen. No one was leaving. No one wanted to go home yet. They all wanted to stay in the glow of the impossible thing that had just happened. Anya stood near the edge of the stage, the heavy crystal trophy tucked under one arm like a football. She was smiling, but it was a tired, slightly dazed smile. Reporters were waving microphones and recorders in her face, asking questions that all sounded the same. How did you feel? What was going through your mind? Are you a genius? Anya answered them politely, giving short, simple answers. She didn't know how to explain that she wasn't a genius in the way they meant. She didn't have a secret formula or a magic pill. She just looked at the world differently. She tried to tell them that math was a language, and she was just fluent in it. But they seemed to want a more dramatic story. They wanted to hear about lightning bolts and superpowers. She just gave them the truth, and they nodded and scribbled in their notebooks, probably going to write whatever they wanted anyway. Through the crowd of adults and cameras, she saw a gap opening up. Julian, the boy with the fancy mechanical pencil, was walking toward her. The crowd parted for him, watching with intense curiosity. Julian looked different now. His perfect posture had slumped a little, and his hair was messy from running his hands through it. He didn't look angry, which surprised everyone. He looked humbled. He walked up to Anya, stopping just a few feet away. He was taller than her, and for a second, he looked like the intimidating champion he was earlier that day. But then he extended his hand. That was incredible, Julian said. His voice was quiet but sincere. Anya looked at his hand, then up at his face. She saw the respect in his eyes. It wasn't fake. It was the look of someone who had met a mountain they couldn't climb, realized they enjoyed watching someone else climb it. Thank you, Anya said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm. Your work on the second layer was really fast. I saw you. Julian shook his head, letting out a short breath. I was going in circles. I was trying to break the wall down with a hammer. You just walked through the door. I never saw the door. It was hidden behind the bush, Anya said, smiling a little. Julian laughed, a genuine sound this time. Well, you saw it. Congratulations. You deserve it. He squeezed her hand one last time and turned to walk away. He stopped to sign an autograph for a little boy in the front row, something he probably wouldn't have done an hour ago. Winning didn't just change Anya. It seemed to soften the edges of everyone around her. It reminded them that they were all just students doing their best. Eventually, the event organizers started gently ushering people toward the exits. The lights in the ballroom were dimmed, turning the excitement into a sleepy after-party vibe. Anya's brother found her near the edge of the stage. He didn't say anything at first. He just wrapped her in a huge bear hug that lifted her feet off the ground.
You did it.
He whispered into her ear. You actually did it. We did it, she corrected him, pulling back to look at him. You tied my shoes this morning, her brother laughed, wiping a smudge of confetti off her cheek. Yeah. Well, that was the hard part. The math was easy, right? They walked out of the ballroom together, carrying the trophy between them. The night air of New York City hit them as they stepped out of the hotel doors. It was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the stuffy, overheated room they had been in all day. The city lights were blazing, yellow taxis streaming down the street, neon signs flickering, skyscrapers glowing against the black sky. It was loud, chaotic, and beautiful. Anya took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the city air. She felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of expectation, the feeling that she didn't belong, the fear that she was just a wild card who got lucky, all of that was gone. She knew who she was now. She was a girl who saw shapes in the noise. They walked to the subway station. It wasn't a limousine ride. It wasn't a victory parade. But to Anya, the walk felt like a parade. People passed them on the sidewalk, rushing to get home or to dinner, oblivious to the fact that they were walking next to the national champion. Anya liked that. She liked being anonymous again. She didn't need the world to shout her name. She just needed to know she could shout it to herself. As they descended the stairs into the subway, the smell of damp concrete and metal filled her nose. It wasn't a fancy smell, but it was home. They got on the train, finding 2 seats together. Anya set the heavy crystal trophy on her lap. It was cold against her legs. She looked at her reflection in the dark subway window. The girl looking back looked tired, but her eyes were bright, so her brother said, leaning back and stretching his arms. "What are you going to do now? Are you going to take offers from the big universities? Are you going to go on TV?" Anya looked at the trophy, running her finger over the engraving of her name. "I think I'm going to go to school tomorrow," her brother laughed. "School? Seriously? You're a national champion, Anya. You don't have to go to math class anymore if you don't want to." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I want to go. I want to tell Mr. Henderson thank you. And I want to help the other kids in the club, maybe. Maybe we can start teaching them how to see the knots, not just the threads." Her brother looked at her for a long moment. He saw the genuine desire in her eyes. She wasn't in it for the fame. She was in it for the love of the game. He reached over and ruffled her hair, making her giggle. "You're going to make a great teacher one day," he said. "Or maybe a wizard. I haven't decided yet." The train rattled and swayed, carrying them back to their neighborhood. Anya watched the tunnels flashing by in a blur of darkness and light. She thought about the problem on the screen. She thought about the fear she felt when she first walked into the hotel. She realized that life was a lot like that math problem. It looked scary and complicated on the outside. It looked like a mess of numbers and symbols that didn't make sense. But if you were quiet enough, if you looked hard enough, you could find the pattern. You could find the simple, clean answer hiding underneath the noise. She had solved the problem in 58 seconds. But she knew she would be solving problems for the rest of her life. Some would be math problems, and some would be life problems. But now she knew she had the tools to handle them. She had the vision. She had the quiet confidence. When the train stopped at their station, she stood up, clutching the trophy tight. She walked up the stairs and out onto the street, stepping into the familiar rhythm of her neighborhood. She heard the distant sirens, the music playing from a car radio, the voices of people arguing on a balcony. It was real life. It was messy and loud and imperfect, and it was exactly where she belonged. The girl in the blue cardigan walked home, not as a prodigy and not as a freak, but just as Anya, and for the first time in a long time, that was more than enough.